If President Biden wants to transform American nuclear posture and reduce the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. national strategy, he must be bolder than his predecessors.
That's the voice of Dr. Doreen Horschig, current Roger L. Hale Fellow with Ploughshares Fund. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Tom Kalina and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back to Press the Button. Like many of you, the Afghanistan war and the U.S. drawdown has affected me personally and professionally. I've really struggled with the question of what we can bring you on the podcast that would help you understand, help you process, and for those of you like myself who are not Afghan, help you connect with those who are most affected by 20 years of war. We don't have any guests on today to discuss it, but we will address it in coming episodes. What we have seen the last few weeks is only one chapter in a long and brutal war. Until then, I hope you will keep engaging, whether it is donating or volunteering with helping refugees resettle in our communities or calling on elected officials to let more refugees in, and ask for help when you need it.
Hey, Michelle, and thanks for that. I could not have said it any better. And just to add that, we at Ploughshares want to make sure we add something valuable to this conversation. But for now, let me just say that Washington is devolving into the sadly predictable blame game. Those that were champions for the war, and in my opinion, they're looking pretty bad right now. They're pushing the narrative that says the war was a good idea, but that President Biden botched the end. Or that we were all to blame because the war had broad public support. But, there's another narrative out there that says maybe, 20 years ago, we rushed to war too quickly. Maybe we should not have invaded Afghanistan in the first place, and maybe we should rethink our interventionist foreign policy, particularly after the catastrophes of Iraq and now Afghanistan. It's time for a policy reset, and I hope that we here at Ploughshares and this podcast can be part of that. But for now, Michelle, what do you have for early warning?
We are nearing the end of our series on new approaches to American security policy. As the U.S. shifts towards new renewable energy sources, such as solar and wind, it is increasingly reliant on battery storage technologies. So we explain the need to overhaul such policies and why it relates to national security. We also dig into Taiwan's 2020 elections. We look at how China used misinformation and disinformation campaigns to influence the election's outcome and how we can push back.
And after that, I sit down with Dr. Doreen Horschig, our departing Roger Hale Fellow here at Ploughshares Fund. We're going to discuss the Biden administration's Nuclear Posture Review, otherwise known as the NPR. If you don't know what that is, you're not alone, but it's very important if you want to understand the formulation of U.S. nuclear weapons policy. So we'll discuss what elements of U.S. nuclear strategy the NPR might include. We'll discuss previous nuclear posture reviews. We'll talk about what Biden himself has said in the past and what we might expect from the Biden administration's current nuclear posture review. So please tune in. And I also just at this point want to give a shout out to Doreen, who not only will be in that section of the podcast and has done terrific work on the policy front for Ploughshares, but people might not know that she's also played an important behind-the-scenes role in producing this podcast. She's the one that pulls together this weekly intro section that Michelle and I happily walk into that's been already prepared for us by Doreen. So, Doreen, I just want to give a shout-out to you. Thank you so much for all your hard work in helping produce this show and this morning introduction. In particular, we could not have done it without you.
Agreed. And we are excited to see where you go next. And all of you out there, keep an eye out for Dr. Doreen Horschig. She has some great things ahead of her. And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Every little bit helps to grow our show and our audience. We really appreciate it. But with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Dal. Today I'm joined by Christopher Jackson, a PhD candidate at the University of California Berkeley, and Maggie Boughman, a data and language intelligence analyst at SOS International's Center for Intelligence Research Analysis. Thank you both for joining, and congratulations on each of your essays being selected as winners in New America's Reshaping U.S. Security Policy for the COVID-Era competition. As you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear and national security news starting now. Chris, your essay makes the case that the United States should significantly increase research and development of new battery technologies, spur investment in commercialization, and drive demand for domestic manufacturing. Essentially, overhaul the U.S.'s battery storage policy. How does battery storage relate to national security?
Thanks for having me. Perhaps maybe I want to take a step back and think about U.S. energy use more broadly. So in 2019, the U.S. imported 9.1 million barrels per day of petroleum, a gasoline precursor, from nearly 90 countries. And we've recently seen the downsides of our reliance on imports of oil and other types of carbon-based energy sources, such as natural gas, with price volatility in the U.S. Right. So just in early August, the Biden administration was actually asking OPEC to take action to increase production of oil to stem our rising domestic prices. But if you think more broadly, what else can we do perhaps to lessen U.S. reliance on energy imports? And in the context of national security, energy independence, quote unquote, or perhaps more realistically, energy resilience, are phrases that get thrown around a lot, often in the context of expanding domestic oil production. However, if we want to really promote energy resilience in a manner that's sustainable and in alignment with broader U.S. climate goals, renewable energy is going to play a key role. And then the issue with renewable energy resources, particularly wind and solar, which are expected to account for about 70% of new U.S. electric generating capacity additions in 2021, is that they're intermittent. Right? The sun isn't always shining, the wind isn't always blowing. And so therefore, we need an equal or greater, arguably, focus on the deployment of systems that can store this energy for future use, whether that's hours, days, or maybe in the future, weeks and months at a time. And so while there are a number of technologies out there that are still in development or early deployment stages, there really isn't a competitor at scale with lithium-ion batteries that currently dominate the energy storage space.
So how might the United States then go about this task?
Yeah. So the biggest challenge facing the U.S. in this arena is that we're woefully unprepared to meet the manufacturing quotas required to produce enough battery storage for a changing energy landscape. So we have historically and continue to dominate the research and development part of the equation. But the free market approach to production that the U.S. has adopted has meant that we largely ceded the manufacturing to other countries that more heavily subsidize their domestic markets. So today, only about 10% of the world's lithium-ion batteries are produced domestically, and many of their supply chains, including necessary raw materials such as lithium, are located outside of the United States. So first, the U.S. needs to increase R&D funding for new batteries, specifically focusing on those that use raw materials available inside the United States. And at the same time, we need to do the necessary R&D and thinking about end-of-life recycling and reuse for these batteries, which are estimated to number almost 700,000 by 2025. And finally, we should take a page from a lot of these other countries and strategically subsidize industries that make use of battery technology to drive demand for local manufacturing. And that's primarily going to be transportation. So the US federal government could do that right now, and there are some proposals to do so. A report just came out that showed we could save more than $1 billion by replacing all federal government light-duty vehicles and buses with electric counterparts in the next decade. And if you include the US Postal Service, that's an additional $2.9 billion in savings, all of which would be a huge in driving down costs for energy storage across all sectors and really taking a major step towards making the US energy system more resilient and secure.
Thanks, Chris. Maggie, looking at another place on the globe, your essay discusses how we could view Taiwan's 2020 elections as a test case for combating misinformation and disinformation. Now, Taiwan is back in the news, so I thought this was particularly timely. What made this election particularly important?
I think Taiwan's 2020 elections were particularly interesting because they showcase China's efforts to leverage really modern information warfare and influence tactics for electoral change for one of the first times outside of their borders. So China was really quite invested in the 2020 elections in Taiwan because the incumbent DPP candidate Tsai Ing-wen was viewed as a significant national security threat for China. She's probably the most closely aligned president with Taiwan in Taiwan's history with the independence movement. And China wanted to put a more pro-China, pro-unification, and in the China context, it often comes under the word pro-business candidate into power because the stakes of this election for them were unusually high. And they, without much exception, backed this almost unknown KMT candidate, Han Kuo-yu, who rose from total obscurity through almost one Facebook page to dominating first a mayoral election and then becoming the KMT candidate for president in the 2020 elections. So it was kind of the first time that China leveraged unattributed social media manipulation, including things like astroturfing, simulating this grassroots movement, but it was all coming from IP addresses and using simplified Chinese from abroad on a large scale for the first time. So it's really this case study in how China engages in long-term, large-scale social media manipulation operations abroad.
Now, you describe these types of campaigns as being similar to an epidemic. What lessons can we take from public health in countering disinformation?
Backing up a little bit, what's interesting to me is that this example of information warfare as a disease where individuals can become infected and then spread the disease to others and eventually recover, which is described in epidemiology as an SIR model, long predates the pandemic. I found an article written by some Chinese military theorists on how information warfare could be spread as if it were a disease back in 2019, early 2019. So I was really interested in how it could be used how you could combat it using the same analogy. And I think we can really learn from public health the value of centralized reporting of individual cases, how we can track the spread of similar strains and cases, and identify people who might act as things like super spreaders. So looking at exposed individuals and generally developing a crowdsourced database to develop a more comprehensive picture of this epidemic of disinformation. And hopefully by learning who is vulnerable, how disinformation spreads, which strains are the most transmissible and the most believable, most likely to be passed on, we'll finally have the data that we need to combat disinformation. And just more broadly, countering disinformation can feel like a new problem, and therefore one without existing solutions. So borrowing from disciplines that have managed similar problems before, where we fine-tuned how we combat the issue, can bring structure to a problem that feels really new and hard to approach.
Well, Maggie, Chris, our 7 minutes are up. Thank you so much for joining.
Today we are talking about something wonky but important. The Biden administration's Nuclear Posture Review, or NPR, not to be confused with your favorite radio station. The Posture Review is the most important part of U.S. nuclear policy that you may have never heard of. Like a comet, they come along once every few years as a new president enters the White House. Presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump have all done NPRs. Biden started his Nuclear Posture Review this summer, and it should be finished in a year or so. So, what are nuclear posture reviews, and what do they do, and do we really need them? Here to help us answer these questions is Dr. Doreen Horschig. She is the current Hale Fellow at Ploughshares. She is also a research associate at the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida. And in October, she'll move from Florida to Boston to start a new post at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology as a Stanton Nuclear Security Postdoctoral Fellow. And maybe most important for our purposes, she just finished a new interactive report on the Biden Nuclear Posture Review that you can find on our website. Doreen, great to have you here.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the basics. You've been digging through the previous administration's NPRs, and you've been getting a good sense of kind of what they are. So tell us, what is a nuclear posture review? How many have we done? And in your view, how important are they?
Yeah, so the nuclear posture review is really still a fairly new standalone policy review. And like you said, we only had 4 so far since President Clinton released the first one. These NPR are basically the US government's primary public statements of what the country's nuclear weapons policy will look like in the next 5 to 10 years. And their purpose really is to inform US government personnel, but also the allies, the public, and adversaries of US intentions and the capabilities. And they also inform US arms control and non-proliferation policy. The policy shifts in the NPRs that we've seen so far, they generally reflect the views of the new incoming administrations as they take office. And they usually lay out several elements of US nuclear strategy, the doctrine and planned forces of the new administration, and now in our case, the Biden-Harris administration. So that can include elements such as deterrence and extended deterrence, the strategic triad, employment policy, and the posture, as well as declaratory policy and hedging and signaling. So as you said, the Biden administration is currently undertaking its own review, and that's what I've been working on in the past few months.
Great. And as you've been looking across the previous NPRs, have you seen any trends, any similarities and differences?
Yeah, so we've had a few small tendencies, such as, for example, that Democrats have tended to seek a narrowing of the declared role of nuclear weapons, whereas we've seen the Republicans tended to expand the role by including deterrence of non-nuclear strategic attacks and rejecting arms control agreements. But overall, there's been, despite these differences, some similarities. So all NPRs, they share that same overarching goal of preventing nuclear war. And they also share some guiding principles that we've seen in US nuclear policies in the past that, for example, includes the protection of the US, its allies, and its partners. Then in general, this fundamental role of nuclear weapons as deterrent tool in US defense policy, and also the commitment to the highest international standards of stewardship for nuclear safety, security, command and control, and so on. So in all NPRs, deterring a nuclear attack and responding to such attacks if deterrence fails has been the primary, but never the sole purpose of US nuclear forces. And nuclear forces also deter still major conventional war with Russia and China, as well as catastrophic non-nuclear strategic attacks on population from any source.
And so what were some of the takeaways from the most recent reviews by Obama and Trump?
Yeah, so let me start with Obama, and then I'll tell you what Trump did. So President Obama made an attempt to de-emphasize the role of nuclear weapons in US security strategy. And he proposed this limited role by giving significant consideration to non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. But overall, he remained unachieved during his administration. Instead, actually, many key aspects of President Bush's more belligerent nuclear posture were preserved, and the most ambitious modernization programs in 3 decades endorsed. Obama's NPR also did not rule out a nuclear response to conventional, biological, and chemical weapons attacks. So he continued this deterrence of several other attacks despite nuclear attacks. So he proposed a narrow range of contingencies under which nuclear weapons could be used in response to these non-nuclear threats, keeping an ambiguous wording in a way. However, despite that, he did achieve some significant pieces of broader US nuclear security via arms control agreements such as New START and the Iranian nuclear deal. But overall, we can say that, Obama stayed unachieved in his goal of disarmament and non-proliferation. And then we had President Donald Trump. He, on the one hand, continued Obama's strategy, especially the modernization aspects, but he also even further expanded the role of nuclear weapons in his 2018 NPR in response to what was perceived as a deteriorating threat environment. So his NPR mentioned Russia and China as main causes for increased international threats. And so his view proposed the deployment of smaller nuclear weapons, so-called low-yield nuclear weapons. He maintained the need for a nuclear triad, and he also de-emphasized arms control and non-proliferation agreements.
And one of the issues that, as you mentioned, the Obama administration was looking at was no first use, which they ultimately didn't go for, nor were they able to achieve a declaration of sole purpose, that the sole purpose of the U.S. arsenal would be deterrence of nuclear attack solely. And then, of course, the Trump administration came along and closed that door and said, deterrence is not the sole purpose of nuclear weapons. So in your view, have any of the nuclear posture reviews significantly altered U.S. nuclear strategy?
Yeah, Tom, to be honest, no, or at least not significantly. So overall, there's been a great degree of continuity in US nuclear strategy, even as nuclear forces and force posture have evolved significantly over the period. We had no review made a serious commitment to reducing the role of nuclear weapons in the foreseeable future. And some had no such focus from the outset, and others, such as Obama's, did not succeed in achieving such goal. So I think it's safe to say that no NPR significantly transformed American nuclear posture.
So, some would look at this and argue that posture reviews are not that useful, in part because the White House delegates the analysis to the Pentagon. And as we know, the Pentagon tends to like its nuclear weapons, and therefore not much changes. So, an alternative way to do this would be for the White House, for the new president, because, of course, these are the president's weapons, after all. The president could come in and write a document that lays out what the president wants. In other words, tell the Pentagon, this is what I want our nuclear policy to be, and you, the Pentagon, shall go implement. But that's not the way it tends to operate. What is your take on all this?
Yeah, so Tom, this is a good question. And reasonable people can disagree over who should guide this NPR process. So normally in a democratic government, policy should guide the US security posture. Because after all, the Department of Defense and the military work for the president and not vice versa. But with everything else that's currently on the Biden administration's agenda, it's easy in a way to hand off this review of nuclear posture. In my view, the NPR gives Biden a chance to actually bring his views on nuclear policy forward, but he might miss this opportunity. He should, in my view, use his executive authority to make his past, more progressive nuclear security agenda happen.
Well, thanks for that. And regardless of whether we think this is a good idea or not, it's happening. We are in the midst of the Biden's nuclear posture review. So what, in your view, are the key issues that are going to drive this process that the Biden team is going to have to grapple with?
Yeah, so some key issues are, for example, how this perceived worsened security environment will drive adjustments to U.S. forces. Then also whether Biden will confirm key elements of U.S. long-term nuclear policy and posture, whether he will carry forward the bulk of the Obama-Trump modernization program, Then we also have Russia and China, whether he will engage with them each bilaterally on arms control and strategic stability, and whether and how he will press for strengthened non-proliferation agenda. So there are definitely a lot of issues. And really in my article, I focused on nuclear declaratory policy.
And on that front, what clues has Biden given us in his past statements that could help us understand where he might go?
President Biden has held long-standing views to reduce the role that nuclear weapons play in U.S. security policy, to decrease the likelihood of nuclear war, and to oppose the development of unneeded new nuclear weapons. We have him on record as senator, as vice president, and presidential candidate when he has consistently promoted a more limited role. And the NPR now gives him an opportunity to really follow through on his words and views. He's been a firm supporter of also nuclear arms control. His administration has renewed, as we said, New START by 5 years. And he also agreed to strategic stability dialogue with Russia. And now his team has been negotiating in Vienna to revive the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. So any declaration that doesn't reflect his previous views of a reduced role of nuclear weapons would actually not be consistent with what he has stated previously.
In your online interactive article, what do you suggest a Biden nuclear posture review should look like? What policies do you think he needs to address to be consistent with his promises?
So in my article, I suggest that a Biden NPR should be based on this overarching goal of preventing nuclear warfare, which can be achieved through reducing the risk of accidental war. Since the Cold War, the United States has designed its arsenal to deter and respond the most extreme case of a surprise, which would be an intentional large-scale Russian nuclear attack. But that has never arrived. And as you, Tom, also explained in your testimonies before the Senate Armed Service Committee in June, U.S. policy right now is oriented around this unlikely threat. And it can increase the risk of accidental war. The U.S. really could blunder into a nuclear war by mistake. So in my article, I highlight the numerous close calls that we have had. And they are examples of, human error, false alarm, or miscommunication that could have caused a nuclear war. And we're not just talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. In order to reduce this risk of accidental war, I argue that Biden should follow 3 policies that he can implement to follow through as president, which includes ending sole authority, declaring a sole purpose policy, and determining the launch on warning policy. So first, ending sole authority. There is really no need to have a single person make a quick launch decision to save nuclear attack capabilities. Currently, we have the president have unilateral authority over nuclear launch decisions. And this was actually never legislated by Congress nor enshrined in the Constitution, but adopted unilaterally by the first president of the atomic age. Today, we just assumed this to be a key part of presidential power and privilege. So, as you will see in my article, I propose that a new policy could, for example, introduce shared authority with Congress or a subset of Congress. So my second argument is a sole purpose policy. That is something that Biden has proposed as vice president under Obama, and he has reaffirmed this as presidential candidate in 2020. The sole purpose would suggest that the U.S. nuclear weapons serve one single purpose, and that's declaring nuclear use against the U.S. or its allies. So nuclear weapons should not be used for warfighting or to retaliate against any type of attack other than a nuclear attack. And lastly, to be more credible, a new declaratory policy should end this launch of ICBMs on warning of an incoming attack. ICBMs currently can be launched promptly once the president is informed of a possible attack, and that just increases the risks of a nuclear war. So ending sole authority, declaring sole purpose, and terminating launch on warning can reduce the risk of nuclear war. If President Biden wants to transform American nuclear posture and reduce the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. national strategy, he must be bolder than his predecessors.
Now, could not agree with you more. Another issue they might consider is reversing some of the nuclear modernization decisions of the Trump administration. For example, development of a new land-based ballistic missile. Do you think they'll make any progress on that?
Yeah, this is another good question, Tom, and it has been a matter of debate for the last few months. As of now, the Biden administration's fiscal year 2022 budget requests for nuclear weapons contains the budget for every nuclear weapons program proposed by the Trump administration. And that includes this new ICBM, the ground-based strategic deterrent. And at the moment, it really does not look like Biden will reverse this modernization. The purpose of the NPR is to explain the role of nuclear weapons by taking into account the international environment. And the military-industrial complex really uses this environment, notably Russian and Chinese nuclear modernization, to argue for more US modernizations as well. And whether this, what we really can call a second nuclear arms race, creates more stability in the international system, well, that is a debate for another day. So, Biden might not reverse nuclear force modernization, but that's why it's incredibly important that security is created in different ways and at a minimum in his nuclear declaratory policy. If the nuclear force is modernized, Biden at least has an opportunity to reestablish sobriety in American declaratory policy via the 3 steps that I outlined.
Thanks for that. We are approaching the end of our time, but a couple of final questions here. Where can listeners go to read your article?
Yeah, you can find it on the Ploughshare Fund's website. That's ploughshares.org on the reports. And as you said earlier, it's a fun, interactive format, and you should check it out.
I encourage people to do that as well. And Doreen, you've been a Hale Fellow here at Ploughshares Fund. Your tenure is ending. We thank you so much for all of your great work while you were here, but tell us what's in store for you next.
Yes, so I'll be diving back into academia and starting a postdoctoral fellowship at MIT in September. I'm very excited to expand on my dissertation. I've been looking at public opinion on the use of nuclear weapons in Israel. So I'll be taking that back up, but I will surely miss my colleagues here at Ploughshares Fund. And I can't thank everyone enough for letting me be part of such a great team. It's been really great diving into the policy and advocacy world and learning so much about the nuclear field from a very different perspective than I had before under the doctoral program. And I really think this will help me so much in the future, because as I go back to academic research, I will make sure to make my research policy relevant and also help foster this dialogue between the various fields. Yeah, but if any of our listeners are interested in an outstanding opportunity to work at a leading peace and security institution at the forefront of nuclear nonproliferation policy, then go visit Ploughshare's website. The application deadline for the Roger Hale Fellowship is open until September 15.
Thank you, Doreen, for that plug. I definitely encourage applicants to go check out the Hale Fellowship, which, as Doreen said, we are doing a search for the next Hale Fellow. Deadline the middle of September. And Doreen, just to say again, it was a great pleasure having you here at Ploughshares. Really, it's been a great experience working with you. We wish you all the best in your next adventure at MIT, and we look forward to keeping in touch. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks so much for having me, not only on the podcast, but as your Hale Fellow.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Alex Hall in Washington, D.C., and Delphine Vigil in San Francisco, with research and assistance from Doreen Horschig and Harry Tarpey. Sound design and audio engineering by Michael Padilla at the Soundport Recording Studio in Grass Valley, California. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.